Morning. I was coming up this morning, coming up M15 from Davison. We might be right at about the peak of color. At least that stretch through there is really beautiful. It's amazing to see God's work. Okay, Nehemiah, week 15. We're in chapter 11. And another one of those difficult chapters because we got these long lists of names of people and what they did. So it's kind of hard to sort out everything here. But we had, last week we had started in chapter 11. In the first 11 verses 1 and 2, it says, "Now the leaders of the people lived in Jerusalem, and the rest of the people cast lots to bring 1 out of 10 to live in Jerusalem, the holy city, while 9 out of 10 remained in their own towns." So we had read that last week, and we talked about that some of these citizens volunteered willingly to, while others had to be drafted. And the people had promised to tithe their produce, so Nehemiah decided to tithe the people, and 10% were chosen by lot to move from the villages out surrounding Jerusalem into the city. In these chapters that we've looked at in Nehemiah, we have found a number of listings of the names of people who were involved in the projects. And back in chapter 3, we had he told us who the people were who worked on the wall and what part of the wall that they had repaired. And in chapter 7 lists the names of the people who returned with Zerubbabel. And in chapter 8 records the names of the leaders involved in the Bible conference that they had right after they had completed the walls at the water gate. And then chapter 10 contains the names of the 84 men who set their seals to the dedication covenant. And now we come to another list here in 11 and 12. So now in the next list, the people of Judah and Benjamin who lived in Jerusalem are listed first, and they're listed in verses 4 through 9. And I'm not going to read all of those, mainly because I can't. And then the priests and the Levites and the temple workers are named in verses 10 through 24. And it takes a variety of people a variety of people are needed for the temple ministry, and that was so important for the Jewish nation. The priests officiated at the altar, and the Levites assisted them. Some supervised the maintenance of the building, as it talks about in 11:16, while others ministered with prayer and praise in verses 17 and 22, and both were important. And that's where we'd stopped. That's where we left off last week. Now there was in verse 18. It lists that there were almost 300. There were all the Levites in the holy city were 284, so almost 300 men were appointed to guard the temple. And since the tithes and offerings were stored in the temple, it was important that the building be protected. It took many people with many skills to maintain the ministry in Jerusalem. And God uses many people with different gifts and skills to to get his work done in this world. Each person is important and each task is significant. In chapter 11, verse 23, it says, "For there was a command from the king concerning them, and a fixed provision for the singers as every day required." Now, what it's kind of talking about here, the king is referring back to the king in Persia. I think it's Artaxerxes the first, but I should have looked that up. But anyway, in 23 states that the king of Persia helps support the ministry at the temple. And since the king wanted the Jewish people to pray for him, and I think back in, I can't remember, it was either in Ezra or early Nehemiah, the king had requested that the Jews pray for him. Since the king wanted the Jewish people to pray for him and his family, he shared the temple expenses. And back in Ezra 6, verses 8 through 10, he talked about, he helped fund this move from Babylonian to Jerusalem. And it was talked about in Ezra 6 in verses 8 through 10, and chapter 7, verses 20 through 24, where it talked about where the king of Persia was going to support these people out of their own treasuries. In verse 11:24, there's a guy mentioned here, and Pethahiah, I think is the way I got it phonetically spelled here, Pethahiah, the son of Meshezabel, and the sons of Zerah, and the son of Judah, was at the king's side in all the matters concerning the people. Well, this guy, Pethahiah, he was an official of the Persian king. He was the official that came back with Nehemiah. So he was an official of the king of Persia. So he's mentioned here. He was the king's agent who represented the Jews at court. That's who that guy is right there. In Nehemiah 25 through 36 in chapter 11, names the villages where the Jews were living, some of which were quite a distance from Jerusalem when the exiles had returned from the land, returned to the land from Babylon. And of course, these people kind of spread out because they would want to settle in their own native towns and villages, but they would still be under the authority of Nehemiah and expected to be loyal to the king of Persia. This loyalty to their native cities was what helped make it difficult for Nehemiah to get people to reside in Jerusalem. So we're going to move on down and move into chapter 12. I'm going to pick up in verse 27 because this is the dedication of the wall. Because remember, we'd already talked about the wall was finished. Now this section in here is where they're going to dedicate the wall. And I'm going, yep. Right.
Had come from the tribe of Levi. Specifically, we're dealing with certain people in Aaron's descendancy and others. And I think some of what's there is making sure that that's followed. Because if you
Yeah, and I think I spoke about that 2 or 3 weeks ago. You weren't, yeah, I think it might have been while you weren't here, but we had some discussion about that they needed that link, that they needed that, but I did mention it before. Okay. They may not have remembered it, but I did mention it. Okay. So now we're going to, in this section here where we're going to, for the dedication of the wall, this is where where they're going to, they're also praising God in this section for that. And I think I'm going to, from verse 27 to 42, I think I'm going to let it be read to us because there's some bits and pieces in there. I don't know, we got all these names, but it kind of tells about what happened here. So let me play this and see if, again, we're going to have a lot of names they're hard to pronounce, but we got a little bit of what's going on. So let's see what
Chapter 12. These are the priests and the Levites who came up with Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua.
I didn't want to start
Seraiah,
there.
Jeremiah, Ezra, Amariah, Malach, Haddush, Shechaniah, Ream, Meremoth, Iddo, Genethoi, Abijah, Mijamin, Maadiah, Bilgah, Shemaiah, Joiarib, Jedaiah, Salu, Amok, Hilkiah, Jedaiah. These were the chiefs of the priests and of their brothers in the days of Jeshua. And the Levites, Jeshua, Binnui, Kadmiel, Sherebiah, Judah, and Mattaniah, who with his brothers was in charge of the songs of thanksgiving. And Bakbukiah and Unai and their brothers stood opposite them in the service. And Jeshua was the father of Joachim, Joachim the father of Eliashib, Eliashib the father of Joiada, Joiada the father of Jonathan, and Jonathan the father of Jaddua. And in the days of Joachim were priests, heads of fathers' houses. Of Seraiah, Meraiah. Of Jeremiah, Hananiah. Of Ezra, Meshullam. Of Amariah, Jehohanan. Of Malachi, Jonathan. Of Shebaniah, Joseph. Of Haram, Adnah. Of Meraioth, Helkai. Of Iddo, Zechariah. Of Genethon, Meshullam. Of Abijah, Zichri. Of Miniamin of Moadiah, Piltai. Of Bilgah, Shemua. Of Shemaiah, Jehonathan. Of Joiarib, Mattani. Of Jedaiah, Uzai. Of Salai, Kalai. Of Amok, Eber. Of Hilkiah, Hashabiah. Of Jedaiah, Nethanel. In the days of Eliashib, Joiada, Johanan, and Jaddua, the Levites were recorded as heads of fathers' houses. So too were the priests in the reign of Darius the Persian. As for the sons of Levi, their heads of fathers' houses were written in the book of the Chronicles until the days of Johanan the son of Eliashib. And the chiefs of the Levites, Hashabiah, Sherebiah, and Jeshua the son of Kadmiel, with their brothers who stood opposite them, to praise and to give thanks, according to the commandment of David the man of God, watch by watch. Mattaniah, Bakbukiah, Obadiah, Meshullam, Talmon, and Akub were gatekeepers standing guard at the storehouses of the gates. These were in the days of Joachim the son of Jeshua, son of Jozadak, and in the days of Nehemiah the governor, and of Ezra the priest and scribe. And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem they sought the Levites in all their places, to bring them to Jerusalem to celebrate the dedication with gladness, with thanksgivings, and with singing, with cymbals, harps, and lyres. And the sons of the singers gathered together from the district surrounding Jerusalem, and from the villages of the Netophathites, also from Beth Gilgal and from the region of Geba and Asmaveth, for the singers had built for themselves villages around Jerusalem. And the priests and the Levites purified themselves, and they purified the people and the gates and the wall. Then I brought the leaders of Judah up onto the wall and appointed 2 great choirs that gave thanks. One went to the south on the wall to the dung gate, and after them went Hoshea and half of the leaders of Judah, and Azariah, Ezra, Meshullam, Judah, Benjamin, Shemaiah, and Jeremiah, and certain of the priests' sons with trumpets, Zechariah the son of Jonathan, son of Shemaiah, son of Mattaniah, son of Micaiah, son of Zachar, son of Asaph, and his relatives, Shemaiah, Azarel, Milalai, Gilalai, Maai, Nathanael, Judah, and Hanani, with the musical instruments of David the man of God. And Ezra the scribe went before them. At the fountain gate they went up straight before them by the stairs of the city of David, at the ascent of the wall, above the house of David, to the water gate on the east. The other choir of those who gave thanks went to the north, and I followed them with half of the people on the wall, above the tower of the ovens, to the broad wall, and above the gate of Ephraim, and by the gate of Jeshanah, and by the fish gate, and the tower of Hananel, and the tower of the 100, to the sheep gate. And they came to a halt at the gate of the guard. So both choirs of those who gave thanks stood in the house of God, and I and half of the officials with me, and the priests, Eliakim, Maaseiah, Miniamin, Micaiah, Elioenai, Zechariah, and Hananiah with trumpets, and Maaseiah, Shemaiah, Eleazar, Uzai, Jehohanan, Malchijah, Elam, and Ezer. And the singers sang with Jezrahiah as their leader.
Okay. You got all those names, right? So the Jews were accustomed to having workers and watchers on the walls of Jerusalem because they'd been protecting as they had been rebuilding the walls. But now Nehemiah and Ezra assigned people to be worshipers on the walls. They conducted a dedicated service with such enthusiasm that their shouts and songs were heard, as it says in 43, which we didn't read. They heard them afar off, even afar off. The people had been dedicated in chapters 8 through 10, and now it was time to dedicate the work that the people had done. And this is in the correct order. For what good are dedicated walls and gates without dedicated people? The emphasis was on joyful praise on the part of all the people. Singing is mentioned 8 times in this chapter. Thanksgiving is mentioned 6 times, rejoicing 7 times, and musical instruments 3 times. The order for the dedication services was unique. The leaders and singers were divided into 2 groups, with Ezra leading one group and Nehemiah following the choir, directing the second group. The processions started probably from the Valley Gate. I don't know how well we're going to be able to see this. So, I got it circled, Valley Gate. Okay, so I think that's where the procession started. On the west wall, marching in opposite directions. Ezra's company, that was talked about in verses 31 to 37, went south on the walls to the Dung Gate. So you can see I got Ezra's name near the bottom, and then I got the arrows. They went around that way. They went counterclockwise. And let's see, went to Dung Gate, and then to the Fountain Gate and the Water Gate on the east wall of the city. And Nehemiah's company went north, past the Old Gate, the Ephraim Gate, the Fish Gate, the Sheep Gate, and the Muster Gate. Both groups met at the temple area where the service climaxed with sacrifices offered to the Lord. So, question could be is why did Ezra and Nehemiah organize this kind of a dedication service? Why not just meet at the temple area and let the Levites sing and their sacrifices to the Lord and send everybody home? To begin with, it was the walls and the gates that were being dedicated, and it was only right that the people see and touch them. But there is another reason for this unique service. The people were bearing witness to the watching world that God had done the work and he alone should be glorified. The enemy had said the walls would be so weak that a fox could knock them down. That was back, we talked about that back in chapter 4, verse 3. But here were the people. Here were the people. They were actually marching on the walls. They were up on top of those walls. What a testimony to the unbelieving Gentiles and the power of God and the reality of faith. It was another opportunity to prove to them, meaning the Gentiles, that this work was wrought by God. By marching on the walls, the people had an opportunity to see the results of their labors and realize that the work had not been done by one person. True, Nehemiah had been their leader, and they needed him, but the people had a mind to work. Various people and families had labored on different parts of the wall, but nobody owned the part that he or she worked on. The wall all belonged to who? God. Okay, I'll answer for you. You know, it's just like when the congregation builds a church. Say they build a new church building. If the individuals or groups in the church start claiming territorial rights, then you got a problem. No matter how much work or money we put into a building program, this does not earn us the right to claim and control some area of the building. It all belongs to God, and it must be used for his glory. So as these Jews were marching around the walls, they were symbolically saying just that, quote, yes, we all had part in the work and a place to serve, but now we are giving it all to the Lord that he alone might be glorified, unquote. Some suggest another reason for this march around the walls. It was a symbolic act by which they stepped out by faith to claim God's blessing. In that day, to walk on a piece of property meant to claim it as your own. God said to Abraham in Genesis 13:17, "Arise, walk through the land, for I will give it unto you." And he said to Joshua in Joshua 1:3, "Every place that the sole of your foot shall tread upon, that have I given unto you." This joyful march around the walls was their way of saying that we claim from our God all that he has for us, just as our forebears claimed this land by faith. But the most important thing about this dedication service was not the march around the walls. It was the expression of joyful praise that came from the choirs and the people. In Hebrews 13:15, it says, "By him," meaning Christ, "therefore let us offer the sacrifice of praise to God continually. That is the fruit of our lips, giving thanks to his name." And in Psalms 69:30 and 31, it says, "I will praise the name of God with a song. I will magnify him with thanksgiving. This also shall please the Lord better than an ox or bull that has horns and hooves." The people offered their praise thankfully. And we find that in verses 24, 27, 31, 38, and 46. And joyfully, also in 27, and in 43 through 44, and loudly in 42 and 43. accompanied by various instruments. It was not a time for muted, meditative worship. It was a time for pulling out all the stops, and praising the Lord enthusiastically. This special service of dedication would have been a failure were it not for a man who had been dead for over 500 years. And that man was King David. It was David who had organized the priests and the Levites. I think it says that in 24. Last part of verse 24. To praise and to give thanks according to the commandment of David, the man of God. And written many of the songs. He wrote many of the songs for the temple choirs. And I think that's referred to in 1246. For long ago in the days of David and Ashpa, there were directors of the singers, and there were songs of praise, thanksgiving to God. So he had also devised musical instruments to use in worship. You see that in verse 36. David had served his generation faithfully. In Acts 13:36 says, for David, after he had served the purpose of God in his own generation, that's the main part of that one. I should have underlined that part of it. That's what I was trying to get to. That he served his purpose, but in doing so, he had also served every generation that followed. In fact, it was David who captured the Jebusite city of Jerusalem and made it his capital, the city of David. It was also David who had provided the blueprints and much of the wealth for the building of the temple. It was not only the professional musicians who expressed praise to God, for the women and children also joined in the singing. They had heard the word at the water gate, so it was only right that they now express their worship for learning the word and worship the Lord. For learning the word and worshiping the Lord must go together. So great was the people's praise that the joy of Jerusalem was heard, as I said earlier, even afar off, in verse 43, 1243. This was now the third time in Israel's history that their shouting was heard afar off. The soldiers shouted when the Ark of the Covenant came into their camp in 1 Samuel 4:5. But that eventually led to a shameful defeat. When the temple foundation was laid nearly a century before, the workers shouted for joy, but their joy was mingled with sorrow. And that we talked about that back in Ezra 3, verses 8 through 13. The shout from Jerusalem during this dedication service was pure joy to the glory of the Lord, and because of this record in the Word of God, that shout has been heard around the world. Okay. Now, picking up now at verse 44, 1244, now we're going to have a service at the temple. Let's see. I guess I can read that. I don't see any names in there that I'll have trouble with. So starting verse 44 to 47, on that day men were appointed over the storerooms, the contributions, the first fruits, and the tithes to gather into them the portions required by the law for the priests and for the Levites according to the fields of the towns. For Judah rejoiced over the priests and the Levites who ministered. And they performed the service of their God and the service of purification, as did the singers and the gatekeepers, according to the command of David and his son Solomon. For long ago, in the days of David and Asaph, there were directors of the singers, and there were songs of praise and thanksgiving to God. And all Israel in the days of Zerubbabel and in the days of Nehemiah gave the daily portions for the singers and the gatekeepers. And they set apart that which was for the Levites, and the Levites set apart that which was for the sons of Aaron. The people had covenanted with God to support the temple ministry, as we saw back in chapter 10, and they kept their promises. Some of the Levites were appointed to supervise the collecting of the produce and the storing of it in the temple. Keep in mind that these tithes and offerings represented the support of the temple workers so that they could serve the Lord. The people brought their tithes and offerings not only because it was the commandment of God, but also because they were pleased with the ministering priests and Levites. The ministers at the temple were exemplary both in their personal purity and in their obedience to God's word. They conducted the worship not according to their own ideas, but in obedience with the directions given by David and Solomon. It was a high and holy day in Jerusalem, a happy day, because the work had been completed and God had been glorified in a wonderful way. Did the blessing last? No, it didn't. And we will find out in chapter 13 why. So, General William Booth, founder of the Salvation Army, once said to a group of new officers, quote, "I want you young men always to bear in mind that it is the nature of a fire to go out. You must keep it stirred and fed and the ashes removed." Nehemiah discovered that the fires of devotion had gone out in Jerusalem. His first term as governor lasted 12 years, and after which he returned to the palace to report to the king. He was gone perhaps a year, but when he returned to Jerusalem, he discovered that the situation had deteriorated dramatically, for the people were not living up to the vows they had made in chapter 10. Nehemiah immediately began to act decisively to change the situation. You know, without spiritual leadership, God's people are prone to stray like sheep. One successful pastor stated, quote, "If we didn't keep our eyes on this work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, it would be invaded and soon fall apart." Moses was away from the people of Israel for a short time, and they built an idol in Exodus 32. Paul would establish a church and leave it in the hands of the elders, only to have trouble begin soon after his departure. Then he would have to write them a letter or pay them a visit to straighten things out. or pressed the Ephesian church leaders as he did in Acts 20. In Acts 20, verses 28 to 32, he said, "Pay careful attention to yourselves and to all the flock, in which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to care for the church, which he obtained with his own blood. I know that after my departure, fierce wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. And from among your own selves will arise men speaking twisted things to draw away the disciples after them. Therefore, be alert, remembering that for 3 years I did not cease night or day to admonish everyone with tears. And now I command you to God and to the word of his grace, which is able to build you up and give you the inheritance among all those who are sanctified." So after Nehemiah was gone from Jerusalem only a short time, he came home to find the people defiled by compromise. So if we compare this chapter, chapter 13, with chapter 10, you will see that the people failed to keep several of the promises that they had made to the Lord. Chapter 13, verses 1 through 3. On that day, they read from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, and it was found written that no Amorite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God, for they did not meet the people of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. Yet our God turned the curse into a blessing. As soon as the people heard the law, they separated from Israel all those of foreign descent. So back in chapter 10, in verse 28 and 29, we had read that the Jews had willingly separated themselves from the people of the land and united with their Jewish brothers and sisters to obey the law and to walk in the way of the Lord. But apparently their separation was incomplete, or some of the people formed new alliances, for they discovered that there were Amorites and Moabites in their congregation, and this was contrary to the law of Moses. Back in Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 and 4, it says, "No Amorite or Moabite may enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of them may enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and with water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, the son of Beor, from Pethor of Mesopotamia, to curse you." Ammon and Moab were born from the incestuous union of Lot and 2 of his daughters, and their descendants were the avowed enemies of the Jews. Somehow this mixed multitude had infiltrated the people of Israel in spite of previous purgings, and it was the mixed multitude that gave Moses so much trouble in Exodus 12. Balaam was the hireling prophet who tried to curse Israel, but each time saw the curse turn into a blessing. Finally, however, he hit upon a scheme to defeat Israel. He encouraged the Moabites to be neighborly and invite the Jews to share in their religious feasts, which involved immorality and idolatry. Balaam knew that human nature would respond to the opportunity for sin, and the Jews would disobey God. As a result of their sin, Israel was disciplined by God, and 24,000 people died. Verse 4. Now before this, Eliashib, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God, and who was related to Tobiah, prepared for Tobiah a large chamber where they had previously put the grain offering and frankincense, the vessels, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil, which were given by commandment to the Levites, singers and gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. While this was taking place, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I went to the king, and after some time I asked leave of the king, and came to Jerusalem. And I then discovered the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah, preparing for him a chamber in the courts of the house of God. And I was very angry, and I threw all the household furniture of Tobiah out of the chamber. Then I gave orders, and they cleansed the chambers, and I brought back there the vessels of the house of God, with the grain offering and the frankincense. So not only were some of these Jews married to the Amorites or the Moabites, but also an Amorite was living in the Jewish temple. Tobiah, the Amorite, had been given a room in the temple by Eliashib, the high priest. Eliashib is the first one named in the list of workers back in chapter 3, verse 1. And yet he had become a traitor. Why? Because one of his relatives was married to Sanballat's daughter. And Sanballat and Tobiah were friends. They were all a part of the secret faction in Jerusalem that was fraternizing with the enemy. Just because a family has been active in a church for a long time and has helped to build the work, it is no sign that each generation will be spiritual or that any generation will remain spiritual. Children and grandchildren can drift from the faith and try to bluff their way on the testimony of their ancestors, and fathers and mothers can depart from the faith just to please their children. Eliashib's relative was privileged to be born into the priestly family, yet he threw away his future ministry by marrying the wrong woman, and Eliashib apparently approved of it. Holy cow. Okay, I'm going to stop right there.
Something else to think about.
Okay?
The Moabites and the Amorites, of course, were living that way back at the time of Moses, pretty sure, because of their treatment of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Ruth, though, was a Moabite,
Yep.
which was David's great grandmother. So David was a partial Moabite, and therefore so was Jesus.
Yeah.
On that, find out why.
But,
Have time today.
okay, find out why that happened?
What's
Oh.
important about the fact that Moabites, first of all, can't go in to worship, but David was one quarter, I think it would be, Moabite. And then David, or Jesus himself would be, slice that up a lot more generations, have Moabite blood in him. There's a significant, something significant going on.
Okay. All right. Any other comments? Okay, we'll see everybody next week.